When I was about 10 years old and visiting Butterworth Farm, where my father grew up and my grandmother lived most of her life, my grandmother took me down the hill to the old stone house to tell me what turned out to be a story about a story. When my grandmother was a young girl, her great-aunt took her into the dark room behind the kitchen and described an experience that to me seems surreal. When I was a girl your age, she told my grandmother, I came into this room and saw slaves sleeping on the floor. It is, of course, a little more complicated than that, but it gets to the point. My family's Quaker farm in southwestern Ohio served as a stop on the Underground Railroad for several years in the 1850s. This family history has hummed in the background of my life as long as I can remember. Mentioned by my father whenever I studied the Civil War in school, discussed on car rides up to the farm, and when I was a kid, and fully explained all the details from the very beginning at family reunions. My grandmother was a history teacher, and she told this story hundreds of times throughout her life, to family members, to students, to my sister's Girl Scout troop once, to historians. This history, I learned through sheer repetition, was supposed to be a central force of who I was. My clearest memory of this story is hearing it that day at the farm. But my favorite part isn't about the Underground Railroad at all. It's how my grandmother began it, not in the 1850s, but in the 1920s, when she first learned about it. My grandmother remembered her great-aunt starting at the same place, her moment of discovery, seeing slaves on the cold stone floor. Now, I have something to admit. Telling this story to about 300 people right now greatly increases the number of people I've told about this. It's about 315 now. My father loves to tell this story. When I would roll my eyes as he told another one of my teachers about it, he would remind me that it's a rare and interesting and truly great story. But I have never felt so comfortable talking about it. Even now, in a room full of Quakers, some of whom probably have very similar family histories, it feels a little weird. After all, these weren't my actions. I didn't risk my life transporting people to freedom and playing up the work that my family did, which they stopped after a few years because it became too dangerous. Sometimes feels like telling a story that has been told too many times before, while ignoring other, more important stories about slaves who were actually endangering their lives, escaping from slavery, and couldn't just stop when it became too dangerous. I have been wholly uninterested in telling a story that, in my mind, gives me more credit than I deserve. And then there's, of course, the other part. When you tell a story about your family, even if you're not trying to take credit for what they did, you're still telling a story about yourself. Where you came from and how you have chosen to live up to or move away from that past. For years, this story has felt like a burden in a way. If I told someone, would they look at me and say, how did she end up like that? Your ancestors fought for freedom and equality, and you're you? I was scared of telling people and coming up short. But when prompted to discuss how I came to FCNL, this story was, despite those fears, the answer. There are, of course, many other reasons I ended up here, short answers that I give to people who aren't familiar with Quakerism. My dad is a Quaker. I went to Haverford College, which is a Quaker school. Every political science major at Haverford is inundated with information about this job. So true, so very true. And all of these things are true, but I think that the real answer resides in that moment at the old stone house on Butterworth Farm, at my own moment of discovery. After years of avoiding this story, I've come to take joy in it, and in the moment that my grandmother began the story, making it not just about the past, but also about her. It's no mystery why she spent her life telling the story to people around her. My grandmother learned about our ancestors' work against injustice and decided to keep going, spending a decade during and after World War II working for the American Friends Service Committee, and her whole life committed to peace and equality. So that's really how I got to FCNL. 12 years ago, in an old stone house, I learned that my ancestors had risked their safety in order to help right injustice in America, and I decided to keep going. I now see this history not as a burden, but as a type of gift. And I'm telling you this story about my family not to take credit for what they did, but instead because it's what has gotten me to so many different places in my life where I have tried to learn how to keep going. To a group of high school students fundraising for schools in other countries, to Haverford College, where a community of love and support allowed me to become a person brave enough to stand in front of you all today. And finally here, to work among all of you, so many of whom have also looked at the history of Quaker activism and thought, keep going. Thank you.